ever traveled anywhere, both days.
He studied
Anthropology.
at the State University of New York in Albany, and he was a great speaker at our last conference. He was, I came to the last conference saying, "Who is this guy?" And I sat and listened, and was just absolutely mesmerized by what he had to say. So with that, we'll turn over to Brant Gardner.
Thank you. First thing you have to do is bring the mic down to human levels. I want to make sure that everybody knew how appreciative I am of how Ferris just thought of everything. They made sure that we had food, and they knew that right after you had food, you're probably going to get digested and, kind of start getting a little bit tired, so they had Brother Barron come in here to keep you awake. But they also thought about that, and they realized that particularly for the people up here sitting in the dark, that pretty soon they're going to get kind of tired of the fact that people were keeping them awake. So they brought me on, I get to put you to sleep. What we want to talk about, I titled The Social History of the Early Nephites, and the problem is I think I'm probably the only person that understands what I mean by that. What we want to do is we want to take a look at the world of the early Book of Mormon and try to put it into a context so that we can see these people as real people and responding to real times, real places, and real issues. That's what's behind it. I took some time thinking while I was out there whether or not I was going to try to be a really interesting speaker and just speak off the cuff, or whether I was going to give you information. Information wins. If I tried to give you this information without reading what's here, it would take longer than they're going to give me. Last time I read through this, I think I was going to run close to my 50 minutes, so we don't want to go quite that far because I'd love to field some questions. So I'm going to read through this thing, and stick with me. What I will hope happens is that you will learn some things about the Book of Mormon that you have not thought of before. To start off with, if we're piecing together a jigsaw puzzle, the most helpful tool that we have is the picture on the box that gives us the big picture of what it is we're trying to put together in the first place. By seeing that larger picture, we get an idea of what the individual pieces might be, and that allows us to put them together. The Book of Mormon is very much that kind of a jigsaw puzzle. The problem is, we don't have a box that tells us what the picture's like. So we have all the pieces and they're sitting out there, but we're missing the big picture. And finding that overall picture becomes part of another piece of the puzzle that we're working on. The task for an historical understanding of the Book of Mormon is complicated in that there are a minimum of 2 pictures of the Book of Mormon that will help us understand the historical framework. Both the Old World and the New World provide gross locations of historical context. Of the 2, the most accessible is the Old World context because we know the essentials of time, location, and the contemporary culture. That means that we got a pretty good shot of figuring out what the picture might be, so that when we place the Book of Mormon events that happen in the Old World against that picture, we've got a shot of understanding what it's like. In this discussion, we're going to examine the New World in an attempt to find a similar time, context, and contemporary culture with which to better see the text of the Book of Mormon. Now, before suggesting an answer, we need to understand when we have found a plausible big picture. For instance, how do we know that we have found something that approaches probability rather than sheer coincidence? If I would suggest that such 19th century sounding elements, such as tents, scalping, democracy, and infant baptism are coincidences, and I do, how can I judge that statement objectively? The Book of Mormon differs from the jigsaw puzzle in that it is not a complete representation of the overall cultural picture in which it participates. Because the text does not clearly spell out the relevant location and contemporary culture, we're free to float among possible pictures, picking points of correspondence between a picture we understand and the text before us. And let's see, we got to get to the point where I read better. That method leads to a collection of coincident points, but not to a comprehensive or a plausible picture of the contemporary culture of the text. To find the correct picture, instead of only a possible picture, we must have a particular type of correspondence. The best picture will not only have single points of correspondence, but complex ones. A simple correspondence would be tents. It's easy to say that the American Plains Indians had tents, and therefore that gives us a context for the tent in the Book of Mormon. it is just as easy to say that there were temporary structures in Mesoamerica. And that gives us a context for the Book of Mormon. Since it's a single point, the real world can freely spin around that point, and we can look at all kinds of pictures, times, and context, because that's a single piece of information. What we need is not those single pieces of information, but complex, interrelated connections so that we have multiple points at which we make that contact. And we can't spin back and forth between an argument that says there were tents in the Plains Indians, there were tents in Mesoamerica. Neither one of those proves anything because both statements are true. The question is, for the Book of Mormon, which one provides the context? If we have a single complex correlation between the text and a particular point in culture, that's suggestive of something, but it isn't conclusive. Because again, if we're really lucky, you could have a coincidence that just so happened to match 2 or 3 coincident points. What we really need, if we're going to get a good determination of what the picture of the Book of Mormon is a multiple set of complex interrelating points. The more things that start stacking up against each other, the more things that require the same interpretive picture, the more pieces of the puzzle that fit together in only one way, the more chance we have of understanding that what we found is a picture that actually has a chance of representing the cultural context of the Book of Mormon. Now, of the 3 critical components of an interpretive picture, the only one that I'm really going to deal with in this discussion is the cultural context. The time we don't have to worry about. Time is told to us in the Book of Mormon. Whether we deal with 1 or 2 years here or there as part of the correlation is really irrelevant because we can't date things historically in archaeology that tightly anyway. So we have to deal with the rough time, and we know the time from the Book of Mormon, and we know when it's going to show up in the New World. As for a location, I'm not a geographer. The best geographical correlation of which I'm aware is John Sorensen's correlation. They call it the limited Tehuantepec theory. And for the purposes of what we're going to talk about, assume that I accept that. What we're going to do is say if the Book of Mormon is to have taken place at the time that it says it took place, and in the location that it appears plausible to have taken place according to this correlation, what do we learn? What can we tell about the Book of Mormon given that background and that cultural context? We necessarily begin with the origin of Lehi's people in the New World. It is indisputable that Lehi and his company landed on a coast. Think about that. Had to happen. John Sorensen was the first one to point that out to me, and I said, oh, yeah, I guess you're right. And yeah. And the coast of Guatemala is the plausible location according to Sorensen's reconstruction. If a ship carrying Lehi's party were to arrive on the coast of Guatemala approximately 590 years before Christ, what would they have found? Would they have been alone, or would there have been anyone there to meet them? The Archaeological Survey of Middle Formative Sites for the coast of Guatemala deals with sites dated some 200 years earlier than Lehi's landing, so we have to make a few assumptions. First of all, 200 years prior to Lehi's arrival, there were 7 settlements ranging from 1 household to 12 households. So there were people there. Small groups. After this time, the coastal areas saw a peak of population density not seen until the late Classic period over 1,000 years later. It's important to understand that the settlement areas were not necessarily larger, but simply more numerous. So we still have small units, hamlets perhaps at the most, maybe a village or 2, but we have a few more of them. What this tells us is that Lehi's company would have found it nearly impossible to have remained isolated for long, if they were ever isolated at all. Even with a relatively sparse settlement along the coast, the typical radius for finding food would have led to some overlap of territories among the various populations. Those settlements that had been in place for years would certainly have known of other settlements along the coast. Smoke from cooking fires would easily be seen on scouting trips, if not visible without that. And it is quite probable that the arrival of a ship with sails would have been noticed while it was still on the horizon. And although we don't know for sure and certainly couldn't tell you, it is not implausible that Lehi's ship was met when it landed. They would have seen the ship coming. The next thing we learn, Lehi's company entered an area that was dominated by small hamlets and perhaps a few villages. Such conditions would favor the acceptance of their party